and I just want to sing, first of all, Angela's praises a little bit more because it means a lot to have translators of this acumen doing this work. It is incredible. And I also want to say how important it is that the National Endowment for the Arts is supporting that kind of work. And we've long been jealous in the United States of how many other countries in the world realize that making an investment in their cultures is important. So I'm grateful that all of that coincides in your work, which continues just to be awesome, as we're going to talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Do you want to, do you want to chat a bit, or do you want to leap in and tell folks some things? I'll say one more thing.
Okay.
Because in case folks don't know, we just published on our website a stellar interview with Angela done by Karen Knoll, who is doing a whole series of interviews with translators for us, and they're marvelous. This one is just especially great because it feels in-depth and breezy at the same time, which is the mark of a great conversation. So I'm really thrilled to have put that out there. But Rain Taxi's relationship with Angela, or at least on our side, she didn't know about it, began in 2014. We reviewed a book she had translated called Nine Rabbits.
Yes,
I don't remember
Rabbits,
the author's name.
Virginia Zakharova. Yeah.
But I remember handling the book and thinking, we're starting to see translated work from a place that we haven't been able to see it before. That in itself is significant. But I was struck by how the author seemed to have encoded things like feminism and reflections on the post-socialist wave in very interesting ways, such as writing about food. And it just grabbed me immediately, and I recalled it because I'm thinking how the author we're going to discuss today also is very deftly burying a lot of things in there. So,
Absolutely.
but it was a fun. So it's our 10-year anniversary, Angela.
What a wonderful way to celebrate it here. And actually, there's a direct connection between Nine Rabbits and this book because the editor, Buzz Poole of Sandorf Passage, we had worked together on Nine Rabbits, and usually, I don't know how people know about the way the literary industry works here, but it's most of the time the translator knocking on the door and begging publishers to be interested in the work. I mean, there's very little I think something like 3% of the literature published in the U.S. is literature and translation, so it's very difficult. And when you cut out Stieg Larsson and some other things, then literary translation, it remains a very, very small percentage. And so it's usually the translator's job to act as the agent and knock on the doors of the publisher and say, hey, this is a great book, you want to publish it? And this was maybe the one time when a publisher actually came to me, because this is a classic. It was published in 1967 in Bulgaria. It's a wonderful book by probably the best female author of the 20th century canon, a really interesting historian. But my experience trying to get something that's a classic, that the author is no longer with us, is near impossible. And so I'd kind of had it in the back of my mind as a great book, but a very difficult sell on the English language market. And then Buzz, who I'd worked with Nine Rabbits, his partner in this press is Croatian, and he had read the Croatian translation. So he reached out to me and said, and his partner was like, this would be a great book, let's do it in English. Reached out to me and said, hey, do you know this book? And I said, of course I know this book. And so it was really serendipitous, the first time in my, 15-year translation career where a publisher came to me and said, hey, we want this book. So yeah, it comes full circle with Nine Rabbits.
Well, that's terrific. I mean, there are no accidents, really.
Nope.
The Vera's story herself is fascinating, but when you mention that, and it's easy to see immediately, oh, of course, other countries in that region would know this book. It feels very important, and yet it's the first time I think that we're getting a book by Mutavcheva in English.
Yes,
is that right?
yes.
Yeah.
This book has been published in almost every European languages. There's like 4 editions in Turkish. Maybe I guess give a background a little bit of the book for people that might not have.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
the Case of Cem, Vera Mutavcheva was a Bulgarian historian, an Ottoman historian, a historian of the Ottoman Empire, which at that time, living in socialist Bulgaria, and like many countries in the Balkans, Bulgaria was part of the Ottoman Empire for 500 years, but during its liberation in the late 19th century, the sort of national identity narrative was against the Ottomans, sort of, seeing the Ottoman as other and distancing themselves from that history. So she was really kind of groundbreaking in bringing Ottoman history to Bulgarian academia, and then using that background in literature as well. And so she, writing this book, it's such an interesting book. It's been called Bulgaria's first modern novel because the structure is really interesting. So it tells the story of Mehmet the Conqueror's son, Cem. The law of the House of Osman is that when the Sultan dies, his oldest son becomes the new Sultan and all the other brothers get strangled. But Cem was one of the younger sons, but the army preferred him to his older brother, tipped him off, internecine war. This isn't a spoiler because it happens at the beginning of the book. He loses and he goes to Europe. And that's really where the story starts, this idea of this young Ottoman prince exiled in Europe and becomes a pawn for many political sort of machinations that he really doesn't understand. And the interesting thing is that the book is structured as a court of history. So it's as if the reader is in the position of the judge and witnesses. Every chapter is a witness being called, a different politician or a different person who knew Cem, and they sort of give their testimony, sometimes reliable, sometimes not, and talk about this case, but you never hear from Cem. Because Cem is sort of the maybe an impersonification of the Balkans themselves that were sort of passed back and forth between Europe and the Ottomans, and they never, they weren't maybe given a voice in this historical period. And so you never actually hear from Cem. But the really interesting thing, and this is what Eric was hinting at, so this was written in 1967 during the socialist period, and Vera Mutavcheva, the author's brother, had defected to France in the early 1960s. So it's also basically an allegory about the Cold War, this sort of tension between the East and West. A young man, exiled, can't go back, becomes involved in political movements that he might not, be aware of. And so many Bulgarian literary critics see this as a very personal way of being able to express her grief at her brother's defection, but she couldn't write about that openly. So she's writing about the Ottoman Empire, but she's also writing about socialist Bulgaria. So it's a completely fascinating novel from a structural point of view. And when you add in the fact that you never hear from Cem, but you hear from his dear companion Saadi, who's a Persian poet, and it becomes clear that they were lovers. And I mean, the fact that there's a queer narrator in a book from 1960s socialist Bulgaria, I mean, it's a really, really interesting, unique work from the classical canon. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, brilliant, and thank you. Yeah, so with a book this staggering, and I'm gonna try my best to tease out just some of the elements of why it has impressed me. Frankly, I didn't want it to impress me this much because, I was already blown away by the previous book. And if you haven't read Time Shelter, please get a copy from Magers and Quinn. It is a masterpiece. It was immediately recognized as such. And so again, that we can read it in English is a gift. But whenever this phenomenon happens of a writer who is a known figure in their own country, and in this case, in a much more global region, who has not yet been translated into English, I immediately sort of picture this treasure room of what else is there? Are there other books that you anticipate, whether you work on them yourself or not, that should be known? Is there? Did she write more that?
Oh
that
yes, I mean she has dozens and dozens of books, novels, most of which are historical novels based on figures from Bulgarian, Balkan, Byzantine history. But this one was by far her most popular novel and the most interesting in terms of structure, I think. But I wouldn't discount the idea of maybe some other things appearing in English at some point. Some other
Okay.
works of hers. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. Yeah, we'll tamp down that anxiety and not
We
bother
started
you
with the
about it
best,
for a
yeah.
few years. Yeah, but you know what I mean, right? It's like, hey, give us more of the work. Well, and I also want to say that your picture, you're pointing out that this novel that's about the events in the 15th century is written in a way that it's very apparent. It's an allegory for the present as well, and but I would say all presents, all histories, and I had the illusion of this because you have a brilliant translator's forward in this book.
Thank you.
It's absolutely essential. Actually, I love that genre of the translator's forward, right?
Thank
It's
you.
sort of like a
We always do
bonus
that.
and as part of the thing that it's like you get a card with your gift or something. But then Mutevcheva has a forward,
Yes.
and your forward is written now. Her forward is written in 1967, but they start to feel part of the fiction. Like they feel as if they remind us that the point about history is that it's in its telling, and it keeps being told from whatever your present is. So it's fascinating to sort of connect some of the dots from today to 50 years ago to 500 years ago.
Absolutely, and I think it's so relevant now with the war in Ukraine. There's so many, this idea of this, threat coming from the East, and Europe, instead of uniting and getting its act together, is fighting amongst itself. And basically that's why the Ottoman Empire is, able to expand into the entirety of the Balkans. I mean, it's really, and she's a really good psychologist. And so I think you kind of see how human nature hasn't changed in 5 centuries, let alone 50 years. But the really interesting thing is that her characters, these characters who are testifying in the court of history, I guess they're sort of like ghosts because they have the historical perspective. It's not like they're still alive in 1480 whatever. They're actually looking back on their decisions and their actions from that time with the perspective of the 20th century. So it's a really interesting frame for the storytelling because they are commenting on history and on the way humans, and they kind of criticize their own actions because if we had known, if we'd seen this long game. So it's a really interesting, I think for a historian, somebody who's interested in she herself as a historian on historiography, there's that element as well that the characters do engage with.
One thing I was going to ask you is, what did she read? And by extension, what were Bulgarians reading at the time, if you know? Because I felt, again, the structure is so dazzling that I sort of saw hints of everything from Shakespeare's history plays to Derrida. It just, and the post-structuralist ideas were of course ascendant at the time, at least in Western Europe.
Yeah, I'm not sure she had access to Derrida, but I'm sure Shakespeare, and her father was a very famous Byzantine historian, but we actually have a Bulgarian historian, Kirill, here, and you have gone to some of the archives and found some of the original manuscripts that Vera Mutevcheva had worked from, so...
Yeah, right. I mean, I didn't work specifically for them, but I just came across them. They're working something in the papal archives, and I came to the documents that she has stashed, actually. There's some notations over there, protected registers will get used when, so you might remember I used this.
Yeah, so she really was working with original sources. So she was a professional academic historian. So many of the personage, not all of them, but many of the personages are actual historical, and the history is actually quite precise in there. So she was working with those, but then she was also working with all kinds of literary, her coming from an intellectual family. Yeah, I'm sure they had access to all kinds of Western European literature. Her father being a professor of history, he died in 1943, right before the coup of the Red Army in Bulgaria. So I'm sure she had a very European education and upbringing.
I was thinking that there may have been well, there was censorship, so that it
Yes.
might have inflected what people were able to read, and maybe, or compelled to seek out, but.
Yes, but I think whoever really wanted to find something could find it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bulgarians, but I think, you couldn't just go to the bookstore and buy, the latest French novel, but there were people who, maybe diplomats, people who are part of the nomenclature, people that, those books would be available and people would sort of pass them hand to hand, kind of under the table. So,
Samizdat.
yeah, samizdat, yeah, something like that, yeah.
Well, great, I'm all for it,
Yeah.
And, the other thing is that I sort of wanted someone to write a historical novel about her, or at least a biography. Is there
She
one?
has an autobiography, actually, and then there's a big new book by a Bulgarian scholar who about her, and she's an interesting character, a problematic character. I think we should be frank. She, right before her death in 2009, was exposed as having been a collaborator of the Secret Services, and I think most people probably should have guessed this, because coming from a family of a bourgeois, her father was a very, famous pre-war academic, which immediately made you an enemy of the people. Her brother was a defector. I think, looking at that profile, the fact that she was able to publish and have an academic career, it was clear that, she was forced to collaborate. And she was very defiant about it during the last year of her life and didn't really comment on it, but I've talked to people that knew her personally. I unfortunately never met her. Said that it was, that she was very, torn about it. Like, her public persona about that period of her life was one, but then her personal persona. And I actually think it's interesting. There's a really interesting scene where Cem, he's fleeing the Ottoman Empire. He's about to cross the border into Syria, I think. And he stops and he says, if I cross this border, okay, I'm saving my own life, but on the other hand, I have to embrace the enemies that are, against everything my father fought for, and basically embracing all the enemies of the Ottoman Empire in order to sort of save his own life. And I'm wondering, this is total conjecture on my part, but was there a sense of like, okay, I need to, because she was recruited right during this period, like right in the late 60s was when she was recruited. And was there this sense of, okay, I have to embrace this morally repugnant system in order to have any kind of intellectual or creative life in this country. So it's, it's, who knows? It's not my place to judge her, but she's a problematic and interesting figure in Bulgarian culture, for sure.
Yeah, you put it nicely in the foreword when you say she fell into this trap of collaborating, and it is a way of saying it's complex.
Yeah, and there were authors that did not collaborate, and then they weren't published, and so there are people that made the opposite decision in Bulgaria and elsewhere. Magda Sabo, the very prominent Hungarian author, refused to collaborate and was not published. So everybody made their decision for themselves. Yeah.
Right. And it turns out, and we learn this from her forward, that the formation of history and what she ultimately calls the judgment of history, which, as you point out, we're the judge. We're performing the judgment. This is the theme of the book, and it just struck me as a very thin line between what a historian does and what a novelist does, and I'm going to include novelists in the ranks of poets here, because but the importance of listening to those who create poetry and fiction in order to render the judgment of history that we all must do.
Yeah, that line runs through the novel, absolutely, because essentially the person who's speaking for Cem is Saadi, this Persian poet, and he talks very much about his own poetic creation and how, he was sort of dragged away from his, art by the political machinations, but then he finds his way back to that, and the importance of Cem also was picked up by the troubadours as this very romanticized image, and he kind of became, through song, through poetry, these are sort of the Western European bards of their time, how that actually was was almost, more important, than the actual real history, this sort of idealized, romanticized figure of Cem. And that's why I think we don't hear from Cem ever, because he's sort of, we see him in history, we see him in poetry, we see him in song.
Question. Is that a fictional?
No, he was actually known as Zizim. You'll hear this character, Zizim, and he was very popular with the troubadours. That's actually historically, based, yeah.
It's a good question, though. It's important to keep track of what's
Cem
real and what's...
Cem is a historical figure, and he was sort of romanticized by the troubadours. But Sadi is an absolutely, he's not absolutely fictional. It's really interesting. Vera Mutuccio, who's a very, I would say, professional historian, drops in the middle of this historical novel a fictionalized this. There is a poet, Sadi of Shiraz, who's one of the three main poets of Persian, like with Rumi and Hafez. But he lived in the 13th century. And so it's interesting that she clearly used him as a model, but took him out of his historical context and put him in what's otherwise actually a very historically accurate narrative. So it's an interesting mix of fiction and historical, fact.
That's great. And I was about to ask you about the Persian inflections that are so evident for all of us who have, read some of that tradition. But I'm just going to read one line from the foreword because it's just staggering to me how much she can put in one sentence. But it's on this theme. She says, Cem was exhumed 4 years after his death to prove that he was dead. But for us, what is important is not his death, but his life. The life no one wants to describe. And it's very and that she is saying the only way I can describe it is in a novel.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah.
So, Sadi, you confess immediately or plant the seed for us to join you in this passion, that you fall in love with this character.
I love Sadi. Yeah,
and so do we. And I think it seems to me a strategy of her, of Mutavcheva's to make this one character to inflame the reader's passion. Everyone else is sort of a stock figure. But wow, we fall hard for him, and that there is a homoerotic framework around this. I went into it thinking like alert for the clues. He just comes out and says it immediately.
How did this get published in 1967 in socialist Bulgaria? Well, they're not Bulgarians, that probably helped, but...
Well, what could it have been intentional? Like, was it activist to do this?
I think so. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, it definitely was daring and bold, and I think, of course, she, used this whole idea of the Orient as being feminized, and there's some of that, that problematic discourse of the West seeing the Orient as feminine. It was sort of more okay for these, openly LGBTQ characters if they're not Bulgarians. But that said, it's really interesting. I was reading, because I never, unfortunately, met Vera Mutuceva, so I did a lot of reading about articles and responses, and apparently the Bulgarian LGBT community really sees this work as kind of a cornerstone of like one of the first positive representations of a gay relationship. So it's really interesting that Bulgarian readers really identify this as a sort of daring and I would say foundational work in literature. Even in modern 2023 Bulgarian literature, you don't have that many openly LGBTQ writers who deal with those themes. So it was extremely daring for its time.
I think, I'm thrilled to learn that. I mean because again, that's a history for people who need it told. And then the whole thing about the court. It felt like there's a sort of meta-analysis of our entire way of thinking about judicial, so did she have, apart from her own quasi-legal troubles, was that aspect surfacing in her other work or in her life?
I don't know, actually. This is a good question. I can't really answer that question, but I think anybody who works with the Ottoman Empire. I mean, the judicial system during the Ottoman Empire was super interesting because you had the Islamic courts and then the Christian courts and the Jewish courts. So basically any, in the Ottoman Empire was structured on like raya, which is like every religious group kind of was its own social group, and they had their own institutions. And there's really interesting work by historians about how people, of course, are practical, and so if you didn't get the answer you want from the Islamic court, you go to the Christian court. There's a really great saying in Bulgarian that the law is like a door in a field. Like, you can go through it if you want, but you can just walk around it. So I think as an Ottoman historian, I would assume that she did deal with, but I don't know specifically about in her own life, why she chose this structure. That would be an interesting question to ask her.
Yes, in the historical novel about her.
Yes,
Well, and as you say, things haven't changed so much because apparently if you don't like the answer from one court, you just go to the next one. Well, hopefully we've given enough of a little context, but can you read us a little blast?
Yes.
And give some of the flavor. And again, I just to invite people to listen for the really deft economy in this language. I think you point this out as well in your foreword. On the one hand, it feels almost fable-like almost a YA novel, like easy to understand.
It is kind of considered a YA novel in Bulgarian, which is
okay.
super interesting because I don't think it really is, but it's very popular. In the day, it was sort of considered юношка literatura, like, the early version of YA, but yeah.
But again, much like the queer history thing, I think that's actually very good because how many more people are accessing, but then there's this whole other level in which, holy cow, it's amazing.
Yeah, I don't think the kids were getting the socialist allegory. Maybe they were.
They will.
Yeah.
They can come back to it,
But yeah, I'm going to read a section from it's sort towards the end of the book when, unfortunately, Cem and Sadi are essentially prisoners of the French king. But I think it really gives a sense of, this is Sadi is the narrator, and he's very funny, he's very catty, he's very give you and it will explain the cover, which I love. I really love this cover. It's a Croatian artist, actually, who designed this cover, but hopefully it'll become clear. November 10th, 1487. Today we received a thoughtful gift from Brother d'Aubusson, a monkey and a parrot. Cem peered at the monk who brought them with suspicion. In his striving to provide entertainment for His Highness, Brother d'Aubusson offers this modest present, the monk whispered. He set down the 2 cages and slipped out. After spending a half hour contemplating the new additions that had disturbed our solitude, Cem got up. He walked around the cages with a distracted air, before sitting down on the floor in front of the monkey. I was amused as Cem tried to find a common language with the little creature, making funny faces and gestures, silly sounds. Meanwhile, the monkey was studying him, its new companion, in great detail. It apparently came to some conclusion because it finally stuck its paw through the bars and grabbed hold of Cem's finger. Cem laughed aloud with the new, not quite sane laughter hashish brings on. He opened the cage and picked up the animal. The monkey tolerated this and began playing with Cem's buttons. Then it jumped onto the bed and entertained us with some real monkey business. Sadi, Cem asked, still laughing, do you think I can teach it to play chess? Why not? I replied, glad I would now be entirely freed from Cem's silent, heavy presence. You can have the parrot, he said magnanimously. I can't stand the smell of birds. Thus, I became the proud owner of a parrot, exactly what I had so long been missing. I dragged the cage into my little room where there was just enough space for the 2 of us. I dumped it out onto the floor, thinking I would let the parrot starve to death. Perhaps that would infuriate Brother d'Aubusson. I was almost out the door when it hit me. There is no God but Allah, I shouted at it. If I repeat these words to it every day, will it learn them? Should I go on a little bit?
I read the next entry, yes.
December 3rd, 1487. There is no God but Allah. Every morning, as soon as I start to stir in my bed, my parrot greets me with our creed. There is no God but Allah, I replied to the only creature in France that speaks my language and believes in my God. I would have been foolish to let it starve. Cem's companion is even better than mine. I often see them sitting in front of the chessboard. They move pawns, knights, and rooks with almost the same skill. They behave in almost the same way. From time to time, one of them gets up, paces around the room with the same meaningless movements before returning to the game. It's funny. The animal is supposedly doing everything its owner does, supposedly imitating him completely. Yet in the monkey, I see something more human. most likely a striving toward humanness, while Cem is still struggling to destroy his humanity. With every passing day, his behavior grows more immoderate, with no concern for rules or decorum, as if he is satisfied by the fact that he is degenerating and losing the qualities that once made him a brilliant man, an idol to the intellectuals and armies of an empire. Yes, in fact, this is very likely Cem's true essence. Cem, whom I always considered an actor equally good in every role. But on the most fundamental spiritual level, he is an extremely spoiled child. Cem was handsome and charming, talented, magnanimous, generous, attractive, inspiring, when that brought him some kind of satisfaction. The 6 years during which he fought against the encroaching despair were also easy years. Everything and everyone fed Cem with hopes. And so Cem did not turn his back on his good qualities, since he believed they would soon dazzle the crowds again. But the first moment when Cem needed to fight to preserve his personality, now only for his own sake and not as a means to an end, Cem let it fall to ruin. And in that ruination, he found some perverse delight, the delight of torturing someone who either loves you or needs you. I am the former. I who saw a deity in Cem. How could I not be tormented by the fall of my idol? How could I not risk everything to save him? The latter is the world as a whole. What harsher revenge against D'Aubusson or innocent than the destruction of their precious bargaining chip? This is likely what Cem is thinking, to the extent that he's still thinking at all. Yet my friend's calculations are fundamentally off. He cannot scare his jailers with his spiritual self-destruction, nor can he exact revenge in this way, not as long as he is physically alive. But perhaps he can at least get his revenge on me, so long as he stubbornly presents me with the broken image of my former idol. This is a good question, but why on earth does everyone overestimate the love another has for him? Why do we overestimate its durability and inviolability? It's true. I once loved Cem above all else. I would swear this even with my dying breath. But I loved the Cem who I carried in my imagination, and only insofar as the living Cem did not wage war against the image I had created. When the tasks of our daily life hindered me from belonging entirely to my imagination, I came down to earth and collided there with the non-imaginary Cem. Then there was no room for self-delusion. Cem, the man, now inspired pity. This pity tempted me and flattered my ego. When you pity, you are better, stronger, more active. You can help. Yet how long can such a feeling last? Pity, I mean. I still don't know the answer. For the time, my pity, my service, and my help are compulsory. I am also a prisoner.
Yeah, isn't that marvelous? It's remarkable because, as you were mentioning earlier, the troubadour tradition, this tradition we have of valorizing, of making a hero out of historical figures, and I think for a historian to really drill down and say, there's the imaginary and the non-imaginary through this character that we've come to, we've grown with. These are very late entries. It's after exile, and the sort of reduction of reality into this impoverished channel is I think very moving and also very rich with possibility politically because if we can wake up to this, maybe we can change it. Mutafchira says something very interesting in her foreword, almost a bit offhandedly about how the term balkanization is condescending, but again, a very economical way to, tell us to be awake for reducing this complexity to that. So,
And it's so interesting how she also addresses the idea of like historical and geographical fatalism. There's this idea, the Balkans couldn't have been anything but this pawn between the East and West because they're just, on the crossroads, blah, blah. And she said, no, these are human individuals made decisions that have consequences 500 years later. And I think her insistence on seeing, there is a geographical component to why Bulgarian and Balkan history is the way it is, but it's she almost hints at like an alternate history. You know, this could, you know, how could this have been different? And I think, you know, this idea that it is, at the end of the day, human, personal, individual decisions, you know, that make a difference and that have an impact. And I think it's really something for us to think about with what's going on in Europe right now. You know, that this is, you know, there's human beings making decisions. And in this book, I mean, here we see Cem and an unflattering portrait at the end of the book, but the Europeans do not look good. I mean, she's very critical of the European politicians and their motivations for making the decisions they do as well. So I think it's her insistence as a historian that that history isn't this, you know, sort of invisible hand and these sort of invisible forces, that there is human will involved. Absolutely.
Yeah, and human will, and also centuries of paradigms that have, you know, are stuck in clay. But yeah, maybe that's why I had such an emotional experience reading the book, and I think many will, is because I couldn't. It would have been easy if I could just think very smartly, because the translator said to, oh, it's an allegory for the Cold War. But you know, with what is going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East, it felt like it was about today.
Yeah.
You know, and that is a very remarkable thing for a historical novel.
The cool thing is that actually this book has kind of, it's been out of print in Bulgarian. It's in print as part of like a collected works of Vera Mutavchieva, but isn't like as a single novel. And actually, a Bulgarian publisher is now republishing it as a single volume. And when I get back to Bulgaria, we're going to have a double premiere of the new Bulgarian edition and the English edition. So I think it's really good that this edition has reawakened interest, because exactly what you say, I think this is an important conversation that you know, Bulgarians to have. Okay, let's look at this, what happened 500 years ago, let's look at what happened 50 years ago, and how does that, you know, what light does that shed on the current situation in Bulgaria as being a member of NATO, but there's a lot of Russophilia still there. So it's, yeah, I think it's a very topical book for Bulgaria right now even.
Wow, yeah. Well, on that note, maybe one last thing before we open it up to audience questions. But, well, actually, maybe, do you want to just read the last paragraph, or even just starting with
okay.
it? I mean,
Yeah, so... it's really interesting because the book doesn't end with Cem's death. He continues to have this sort of really bizarre and interesting trajectory, and he finally is buried in Bursa in Turkey. So this is the final closing of, and it's interesting to know that Cem also, and this is historically the case, that he is half Serbian. It was very common for some of the women in the harem to be of Christian origin, and so he also is very symbolic in the fact that he's, you know, Mehmet the Conqueror's son, but he's also the son of a Christian, I think, Serbian noblewoman, and so he sort of symbolizes the Balkans in that way as well, and so that, to give a little context. Gifts are often left on the marble slab, even more than on Osman Khan's grave. In life, Cem was a foreigner everywhere, a Serb or non-believer here, a Saracen or Moor among the Christians. Who knows why, but in his death, Cem belongs to everyone, likely because there is nothing more universally human than suffering.
Right? Yeah. Well, I thank you, Angela. I literally could talk to you about this book for hours and hours, but I want to invite our friends here to ask you some questions. Jim?
Translation amazes me, and Robert Bly, one of our great poets from here, wrote a book called The Eight Stages, and
I love that article. I make my students read it. Absolutely, and I make them do the 8 stages, yeah.
But the goal is to end that the translation sing in the new language. Clearly, I mean, this reads like it was written in American English, which you speak, but how did you make that happen? I mean, there's a little phrase in there called monkey business.
Yes.
Which works in English. I don't know if it works in Bulgarian, but
it was something
talk
similar
about
in
your
Bulgarian, yeah.
translation process and how you, because it's rocket science to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I absolutely love Robert Bly, and I love that piece. Yeah, no, I think as a translator, I am a musician, and I actually went to Bulgaria originally to study Bulgarian folk music, and I think that is incredibly helpful. I think, you know, every language has a music, a rhythm, and when I read a book where I potentially might be interested in translating it, I feel like I need to hear what I think it should sound like in English. I need to kind of have this resonance, and then I could be a translator of this text. And if it's not there, I've made that mistake once and will never do it. Like of a book that's a great book, but it doesn't, I don't hear it, it doesn't sing with me, then I'm not the right translator for that book. So I think absolutely there is a little, it sounds a little woo-woo, but there is that moment of like, and I actually have written a couple articles, about, it's about voice, and you have to find the right voice, and it really kind of is a duet. It's Vera's voice, but it's my voice too, and if, we can't find that right pitch, it's gonna fall flat, it's gonna sound bad, it's gonna sound stilted, so, I can't translate every Bulgarian novel. It has to be one that I feel like I can find the voice of, like Georgi Gospodinov with Time Shelter. I've been working with him for maybe 15 years, and he's really tough because he's a poet. He started as a poet, he continues to be a poet, so even though it's prose, it's poetry. It's all about the sounding, he's playing word games, and sound plays everywhere, and so that is where I think being a musical person absolutely helps, and you can read, it's good to read the text out loud in Bulgarian, read it out loud in English, so it's to make sure that those resonances are being kept, for sure.
And do you, in that process, do you sort of perform it to yourself? Because of course you have the performance angle of music as well.
Yeah, no, I don't do a dramatic reading at home, but no, I definitely think, reading out loud though, for sure, is super useful, absolutely. I think you should do it, especially a passage that you kind of feel like you are having a hard time getting a handle on the rhythm, the flow, absolutely read it out loud,
And just to plug it again, for those interested in the music translation connection, this is something Karen and Angela go into a fair bit in the conversation, and it's it's fascinating, yeah. And thank you for saying that about the tone too, because I have to say I laughed out loud when I read that passage initially, that you read today, when Sadi talks got the parrot, and he's like, oh, exactly what I've been missing all my life.
Yeah, Sadi is very funny. Actually, a lot of the characters are funny. She's got a very wicked sense of humor, and those who knew her in person said that she was quite a character. Vera Motuvchieva, the author, so yeah. Other questions?
Just to chip in, well, in the world of translation, as we know, right, the adage goes that a translation is either beautiful or true. In the case of Angela, I would say it's beautiful and true.
Thank you, Kiro. Thank you.
Next question. How much historical research did you do in terms of the 60s era and the 15th century, just to place the language?
Yeah, quite a bit, because he's asking how much historical research did I do about the 60s, about Vera Motuvchieva, and then about the era itself. Actually, quite a bit, because it's in my translation practice, I generally work with contemporary authors. This is only the second deceased author whose work I've translated, so it's very, I feel it almost nerve-wracking, because, having the sense of responsibility that I'm the one bringing her work into English, and I can't ask her questions, and so I wanted to feel like I was being respectful to her legacy and having it. And so luckily I met with some Bulgarian literary critics who work on her oeuvre, and they pointed me towards some texts and met people that knew her and read about the period. And it was really interesting. I didn't use any footnotes in the book, because she doesn't have any footnotes. She's a historian, and she slips a lot of historical detail in, but I didn't want to take away from the first person narration. And so there are some really, I think she was playing some historical jokes, and I think there's, this character Sadi, he's clearly based on the real Sadi, but, time-wise it doesn't fit. There's another character, Batista Spignola, who is kind of like a hired blade for the Italian, a real, kind of underworld thug type guy, and it turns out there's a Doge of Genoa by that same name slightly later. And I'm like, okay, that's not coincidence. I think she's making a commentary on like the ethics and morals of politicians, but it's a joke that only historians are going to get. And I was very tempted to put that in as a footnote, but I'm like, no, that's her joke. It's for the historians, And the worst thing to do is to explain a joke, right? Because then it's not funny. So I decided, whichever, historically, maybe Kito will get that joke. Other people, I don't know. But yeah, she put a lot of these little historical tweaks in the text, and that was interesting for me to research. But then in the end, I decided I wanted the reader to have the experience the Bulgarian reader had, and if they get that, great. If they don't, Vera's laughing at us in the beyond. Yeah, so.
I gotta say, though, I love having these footnotes after the fact because it just reinforces my belief that her freedom to sort of borrow a character from any point in history feels like this is about all time, not just about this moment in time.
And I think I'm sad that I never met her. She must have been a very interesting person because I feel like there is this idea in Bulgarian historical fiction that it has to be very accurate, and that she was this very prominent, very well-respected historian that felt totally free to just, drop totally, the main character is totally fictional, to like play some tricks with history. I think that's great. I think that, she was very unusual in that respect, that she didn't let her, sort of historical expertise as an academic historian limit her fictional imagination, which I think is a really interesting combination, especially for that time and that place.
Oh, yes.
Quick follow-up about the language. Did you choose to use different language based on like the original language? Was it historical?
It's all first person narration, which helps because it's kind of inherently more colloquial. But that said, the opening chapters and many of the chapters, she's an Ottoman historian. She throws you into the Ottoman Empire. And so there's tons of Turkishisms, and there's lots of Turkish borrowings in Bulgarian, but there are Turkishisms that aren't part of Bulgarian, that a Bulgarian reader won't know. And so she immediately, and so it was very difficult for me as a translator because I wanted to keep that environment, that atmosphere of like you're being thrown into the Ottoman court. But the English reader isn't going to have the same context. And what I think is interesting is that she uses Turkishisms that are familiar, but also that are non-familiar, which gives this sort of close foreign feeling where it's the Ottoman Empire, but it's also something that we Bulgarian readers recognize. So it's this really interesting, familiar foreignness that she creates. And I tried to keep that to some extent by like what translators called stealth glossing. So I left in some of the Ottoman terms, like for the ranks and the different types of servants in the Ottoman household, and sort of first person narration really helped because the characters are explaining why they did what they did. So if I could slip in an explanation and in their voice, I hope it works. You guys will tell me, but yeah. But it was difficult because there is archaic language, Turkishisms, a lot of different. The Knights of the Hospitallers play a big part. The Knights of Rhodes, and they have a whole nomenclature for their. It was an interesting register that I had not met before in Bulgarian fiction. So yeah.
We'll come back to you, but go ahead. Yeah.
How many years did it take you once you decided to take this on as a project?
About a year. About a year, because it's a pretty big book and a difficult book, and the fact that I didn't have access to the author. If I, like Georgi, I can just call him up and be like, Georgi, what do you mean here? Like, let's talk about this. But yeah, so probably about a year.
Seems to me it should have taken longer than
that. It could have easily taken longer, but I'm glad we didn't leave it too long because it's perfect timing to come out just sort of on the heels of the Booker. But yeah, about a year, because I like to, when I'm translating, just really dive into and live in the novel. And as a reader, I like to read a novel from start to finish. So I don't like to drag a translation out. I feel like you lose some of the energy if you're not kind of in the text at a sort of finite period of time. So.
Yeah, and this is the second or third time you've alluded to the requirement of passion in translation, and I just want to call it out and say thank you. It's not a job; it's an art. And
definitely a calling. Yeah.
You had a question.
Would you say that you, as a translator, have a specific voice that's noticeable in the works that you translated?
Probably, yes. She asked if as a translator I have a voice that's noticeable in the works that I've translated. Probably, definitely, I think, it's inevitable, it's always me, but I hope that I'm able to finesse that into the voice of the author. And in this book, it was a real challenge because it's like, every other there's Sadi and then there's someone else. There's Sadi, someone else, and everything's first person narration, which gets to be a little bit monotonous. So I had to be very careful to try and distinguish the voices and make sure it didn't kind of get flat and sort of monotonous. So yeah, I think there is a danger as a translator, just kind of like making everything sound like yourself, and I hope I have managed to at least balance that in some way. Working with like an author like Georgi, we've worked together on many things over 15 years, and I feel like I have a good sense of his voice, and I can get into Georgi's voice, and I hope I'm not, projecting that voice onto other authors that are not Georgi, but which is a great voice. I mean, it'd be to their advantage. But yeah, no, I think that's something to think about as a translator, that you're not sort of ironing everything into your own voice.
This book and Time Shelter are remarkably different. So,
Okay, that's good to hear. That's good to hear.
So I don't know this book, and so thank you. I'm looking forward to reading it. But I'm going to make a comparison for a question about testimonies and witnessing that I'm sure you've never heard. That is, I think this is similar to a chorus line in that you have all of those voices coming together in terms of and then forming hopefully so coming to some harmony. I wonder if you could talk a little bit just about the need for story and for these types of stories now.
Yeah. I think this book and also Georgi's book, Time Shelter, these are people who lived under totalitarianism for 50 years in Eastern Europe. And so Georgi's younger, so he was, 20 or so when the wall fell. But it's so important that these are writers, intellectuals that have seen ideology, propaganda, like what we're seeing now, the fake news, that's not new. And this idea of how people remain authentic, have a sense of truth, have a sense of dignity and of honesty, despite living in this very, this world where everything around you is, everybody, this sort of socialist speak, Georgi uses a lot in his work. There's a certain type of register, there's a certain type of language, and the sounding of it is just bullshit, it doesn't really mean anything, but it's everybody who lived in this period knows this type of language, and I think it's just so useful for us struggling with being inundated with fake news and alternate facts and all this sort of things. I think writers from Eastern Europe have so much to say to us about how you can remain an authentic voice, how you can have a sense of truth despite this completely disorienting environment around you. And I think storytelling, Georgi actually talks a lot about this, and Vera too, that it's these individual an individual personal story is what cuts through some of this, this sort of fake ideological, it's these conspiracy theories about this or that. When you sit down and look in someone's eyes and you hear their personal story, it's very difficult to see them as an enemy, to see them as, sort of on the other side of the political fence or anything like that. So I think storytelling is one of the best weapons we have against fake news and disinformation and all that sort of thing. So I think Eastern European writers are extraordinarily important voices for this moment. Yeah.
Aren't these great audience questions?
Yeah.
I wondered if you could speak a bit about the public discourse when the book initially came out, and especially in comparison to now coming into reprint and having this sort of relaunch. It seems like a lot of the discourse is about the queer storyline that ties to the current political situation. So given some of that that type of socialist speak in the ways you could and couldn't comment on things, like what have you learned about the public discourse when this book first came out and what people were gleaning
people weren't really commenting on the queer line.
Yeah.
It was in 1960s Bulgaria. I think it was hugely popular, and actually Vera Mutusheva then sort of turned a lot of her energy from her academic work towards novels, and she became sort of more focused on her fiction. So it was hugely popular, and she sort of became, I would say, one of the most prominent writers in Bulgaria. And I think it was really interesting for Bulgarians to see Ottoman history in this way, because really it had been downplayed as part of, sort of like the part of Bulgarian history that kind of gets just skipped over from about, and so it really elevated, her, but also this period in history as well, and it was extremely popular. And then her other novels then became popular that were more about, there's about Bulgarian Tsars and about the Byzantines, but there wasn't a lot of overt discussion, at least that I've been able to find looking back at the criticism from that period. It's basically pitched as a purely historical novel, so there isn't a lot of open commentary on this parallel with socialism, although I'm sure readers, sort of more sophisticated readers certainly saw that, or about, some of the other more, shall we say, subversive elements, but that's, contemporary literary critics looking back have really, maybe been more vocal about that. So I'm really interested actually to see what happens now when there's this reprint, because there's a lot of people remember it from their childhood and now they're reading it in a different way. And then there's a lot of people who are angry about the fact that she was a collaborator with the secret services, and there's a lot of talk about, well, should she be canceled? Is this novel, really part of the Bulgarian canon at this point? So I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. I'll let you know March, April, once we finally have some events in Bulgaria and see how people are reading this novel now, like 50 years later.
Oh, absolutely. Do let us know. And also, I would like to hope that all the virtues you're saying that are the expansions of the way it's being read now actually are seated in how it may have been read or not read then. I mean, I hope for our organization to champions adventurous writing, and this is why we hope it's sort of infecting people's ideas, and that they're so I would hope that a work so subversive really kind of did get help move the needle a little bit.
Yeah. No, I think she kind of opened up the fact that the Ottoman period was a legitimate area of exploration for Bulgarian writers. That in of itself was quite radical at that time, let alone all the other stuff. Yeah. So, yeah.
We might have time for one more.
In a non-negative way, yeah. There's many negative books about the Ottomans are just the bad guys, But,
Right. Yeah.
Well, there's clearly some Bulgarian speakers in the audience, and I'm sure they have deep objections to your translations of Case of Cem. But I'd be interested. What's your story? How did where you in Bulgaria?
Okay. Well, how much time do we have? I'm getting No, I grew up in the Twin Cities. I went to Burnsville High School. Some friends from Burnsville here. So at that time, I guess the winds of perestroika were blowing even here in Minnesota, because there was a French teacher at Burnsville High School, Mrs. Anderson, who was teaching Russian. She had just gotten interested. And I graduated in 1992, so it was right around the time when the changes were happening in Eastern Europe. And so I took 2 years of Russian at Burnsville High School, and then I went to Yale. And they have an amazing Slavic department at Yale. And so I kept studying Russian. I thought, I was a huge Dostoevsky fan as an angsty teenager. And so when I went there, I also saw that, they have the Yale Slavic Chorus. And I've always liked to sing. And it's, helps, it dovetails with my interest in Russian and Eastern European literature. And I went to the first rehearsal, the first kind of recruitment meeting, and they played Bulgarian music. And I was like, oh my God, what is that sound? I have to learn to sing like this. And so I was in the chorus all 4 years. And then when I graduated, I got a Fulbright to go to Bulgaria to study Bulgarian music. And so, yeah, it's just been, and as we all know, you can't sing convincingly unless you can speak the language. And so then it was clearly I need to learn Bulgarian, and yeah, the rest is history.
No pun intended.
Exactly, yes.
Well, Angela, thank you so much. Thanks to Magers and Quinn.
Thanks to Magers and Quinn.
A hospitable environment as always. And I'm sure
Thank you,
I don't
Eric.
want to overpromise for you, but I'm sure you'd be willing to mingle a little bit.
Absolutely. I think I have to trot over to the table, and if people want autographs, and then then
get your
we can
book
hang
signed,
out.
because
Yes.
Angela is the author of this book in English. So I
Great.
want to always remind people.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you.